Good morning. Good morning. I'll open us in prayer, and I'll begin with a reading starting in Exodus 19, verse 3, going through verse 6. Moses went up to the mountain to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain. This is what you must say to the house of Jacob. Explain to the Israelites. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Now, if you will listen to me and carefully keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although all the earth is mine, and you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. These are the words that you are to say to the Israelites. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for the opportunity to gather as your people. Lord, we pray that we can have our minds and our hearts opened to you, that through the study of your word and the history of how you related with your people, we see how we, your people today, are to live and what this means for us. May you speak through me. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, good morning. I'm getting better at this whole thing with the setup. Okay. It's like I'm getting better at this, and then I changed the slides before I'm supposed to. So welcome. We're on week 4 of 6. So we've got today and then 2 more on the theology of the Old Testament. Old Testament in today's world is what I'm calling it. And so we've talked about who God is theologically in the Old Testament, talked about creation, the role for humans. And then we've got the 2 classes last week and then this week on covenants. So last week we focused on the promises of God through the covenants. How God promised to Noah, how God promised to Abraham, to David. We didn't get into the new covenant promises because that's New Testament. But there was one other covenant that we didn't talk about. And so we're going to talk about that covenant through the context of the law and the theology of the law. So that's going to be today's topic. So the things that we're going to cover, we're going to start with something that is related, even though it doesn't necessarily look related on my slide, which is what is the nature of ancient Near Eastern vassal treaties? And then I should have appended and why we would care about that in the context of the law, which I suppose is the next one. How is the Sinai covenant like an ancient vassal treaty? And what does that mean? Why does it matter that that's the case? And then I'm going to go into two questions, kind of theological for us. So why did God give us so many kind of strange seeming laws in the Sinai covenant? And then are Christians today bound by the Sinai law? And if you're interested in the answer to that question, I hope you're not in choir. Because we're not going to get to that until the very end. So you'll have to watch that on Zoom. All right, so I want to start just by grounding us again where we were last week. So we're not going to go over this too much, but remember, we talked about the definition of a covenant. So a lifelong, unchangeable, solemn agreement between 2 parties in which one or both make an oath, the oath-bound pledge, to perform some sort of ongoing specified commitment or else suffer the wrath of God. So we went through the complexities of that definition, why each part of it's there last week. But we're going to rely on this a little bit this week when we're talking about the Sinai covenant, because even though it's a different kind of covenant, it still fits into the genre of covenant. So, and then last week we talked about this where there were 5 covenants that we pointed out. 4 of them were promissory. That meant who took the oath? God took the oath. Did humans take the oath? No. So this was a situation where the stronger party was making a guarantee to the lesser party, that's humans. So there is one that's different, a vassal covenant, and that one is the Sinai covenant. So this one stands out as having a different form of operation where in fact humans and God both took an oath in the Sinai covenant. And we'll talk about the implications of that. So we talked about the 3 different kinds of covenants. We just talked about the promissory a bit. So I'm just highlighting the slides from last week as well, but the vassal covenant. So the definition here, the stronger party imposes solemn obligations onto a weaker party, the vassal, otherwise known as a suzerain vassal treaty. So the superior party, if you ever heard the word suzerain before, that would be the superior party, the vassal being the lesser party. And then these are solemn obligations that are imposed, but the vassal agrees to it. Again, like we said last week, if there's no agreement, there's no covenant. You can imagine the situation, the scenario I discussed a few times. Army surrounds the city. Emissary from the army comes in and says, "Hi, you can see that my army has surrounded your city and I am bigger and stronger than you." So this could go one of two ways. You could agree to a covenant with us where you will pay us tribute on an ongoing basis and you get to keep your city. Or we could do this the other way. So there is a choice. Now, was there an imposition of solemn obligation? Well, yes, there was. Like, didn't really have option number 3, which is please leave me alone and I'd like to keep my tribute. But there was a choice. It was a choice to enter into the covenant versus stay and fight, if you will. So the features of a vassal covenant. There are 5 sections that you see in a vassal covenant. It starts off with a preamble, which is just a naming of the parties. But again, a covenant requires specified named parties. So that happens at the start. Then there's something about the history between the parties that shows up. And if you remember last time with the Enuma Elition, we were talking about that these things can be verbose. They go on and on forever. After all, if you're chiseling it into stone, you can't exactly go back and delete. So there's lots of words. Then there's the covenant stipulations. This is the kind of thing where you see the this for that. You will pay me tribute, or you will do this, you will do that. I will do this, I will do that. So that's the meat of it. Followed by witnesses. So there are, when you see a covenant, you will see the witnesses to the covenant that are laid out there. And then finally, the oath accompanied by the blessings and curses. So and typically those things go together. It's, I pledge to do this and, if I do, then blessings, but if I don't do it, then curses. Those are kind of the 5 sections of one of the ancient Near Eastern vassal covenants. In particular, this would be the genre of the Hittites in particular. Why do we know about Hittite vassal treaties? Well, they were pretty good suzerains, I'll put it that way. If you are, the one who has the big army, then you're entering into a lot of vassal covenants. All right. So in the ancient Near East, the vassal covenants, we're talking about the what the covenant obligations were. Typically, this is monetary. So you're going to pay us or you're going to give us, so it's like you're going to do gold according to these standard weights, or you're going to give us food, or you're going to give us, linens, whatever, in exchange for protection / the absence of overwhelming force on your city. But the vassal did get protection out of it. And oftentimes that was, the suzerain would provide protection because they wanted to continue getting the tribute. And so if ever you were in a tough spot, you'd call your suzerain, their army would come in and help you out. Now we talked about this a bit last time too. Though covenants are lifelong and they're binding arrangements, it's obvious that you can not do the things that you pledge to do, right? There's nothing that actually ontologically compels you where you become completely incapable of violating the covenant. The reason that it's a binding agreement is that there's an or else attached to it. So if you don't do this, then this bad thing's going to happen. That's going to be the curses. So that's where those blessings and curses come in. If you do this, blessing. If you don't do this, curses. Small infractions typically were met with small consequences. So if you short paid your tribute by a little bit, maybe they'd go and burn a farm down just to let you know that it's important. Or they'd come and take something else of value. If you just flat out refused, and especially if you pledged allegiance to somebody else, then you'd be in trouble. If you said, hey, I'm not going to be your vassal anymore, I'm going to be this state's vassal. Well, now you're going to get the full covenant curses coming at you. And hopefully your suzerain's army can get there before your ex-suzerain's army can get there. Otherwise, you're in a lot of trouble. I made this as one slide, one big sentence, because we're going to need to remember this one. Once the curses are fully carried out, the covenant is over. It's done. There's no more covenant. A lot of the times that's because, again, we said it's between 2 parties that was lifelong, and one party is no longer part of life, and therefore there's no more covenant. But that's not always the case. So as soon as the covenant curses that are described are executed, the covenant's over, it doesn't exist anymore, it's been dissolved. This is going to be important when we're interpreting the Old Testament Sinai covenant as well. So I have a quick example here. I suppose I don't want to go too much into this, but I thought just to give an idea of what these things look like, here is a chiseled out ancient Near Eastern covenant. I'm sure you can read everything there, so I don't need to say anymore. But this is between Marsilius and Dupitesov of Amuru. I have never heard of either of those people before. The date here you can see mid 1300s BC. This would be probably a little bit later than where people would often date, or maybe during, I will say, in the realm of the slavery in Egypt. That's maybe just a touch later than that. So you start off with this preamble with the named parties. So these are the words of son Marsilius, the great king, the king of Haviland, the valiant, the favorite of the storm god. They like the superlatives about themselves. And then it went into the introduction. I'm obviously not reading the whole thing. I couldn't excerpt the whole thing, and so it's just showing the different sections. This historical introduction, you see, Azarus was your grandfather, Dupitesov. He rebelled against my father, but submitted again to my father. But when your father died in accordance with your father's word, I did not drop you. Since your father mentioned to me your name with great praise, I sought after you, and so on and so forth. It's talking about how they have kind of come to know each other and the relationship up to that point, because the covenant marks a new part of the relationship. So then you have the stipulations. This one was pretty clear. The tribute which was imposed upon your grandfather and your father, look, the word imposed is there, I'm not making it up. They presented 300 shekels of good, refined, first-class gold, weighed with standard weights. You shall present them likewise. And do not turn your eyes to anyone else. So pay me tribute, and then don't pledge authority to anybody else. And notice, remember when I said the covenants are lifelong for the two parties? He says, the tribute to which your father paid, you will do likewise. But this isn't a new covenant. So to continue getting that tribute, they had to set up a new covenant with the former king's son. The king's son does not inherit the previous covenant. There has to be a new covenant established with the son of the previous king. The witnesses, so you've got a whole list of gods and goddesses that I tried pronouncing on the video, and I'm not going to do it here. But notice here too, after the list of the gods, the mountains, the rivers, the springs, the great sea, heaven, earth, winds, and the clouds, let them be witnesses. Let all the cosmos be the witnesses to this oath. We're going to come back to that later when we look at some of the Old Testament examples. And then finally, the oath-bound pledge, or suffering the wrath of God. So the words of the treaty and the oath that are inscribed on this tablet, should Dupitesov not honor these words of the treaty and the oath, may these gods of the oath destroy Dupitesov together with his person, his wife, son, grandson, his house, his land, together with everything that he owns. But if he honors these words that are inscribed on this tablet, may the gods and the oath protect him together with his person, his wife, son, grandson, et cetera, et cetera. So remember we said there was the suffer the wrath of God as the definition in the covenant. You can see that here. The gods were the witnesses, including the elements being the witnesses. May you be wiped out by storms. May you be wiped out by drought, whatever. Just may all sorts of bad things that I could possibly imagine happen to you. The worst thing imaginable if you break the covenant. Okay, so guess what else is structured like this?
Sinai covenant.
Okay, great. Be more specific. You already knew that answer. But I will give you an answer. Anybody know where in this book something is structured like that?
Deuteronomy?
The book of Deuteronomy is structured exactly like that. So Deuteronomy, we're not going to go through the whole thing. I'll just do a quick overview, but you can follow the same Hittite vassal treaty outline through the book of Deuteronomy. So you begin with the preamble here. So the words that Moses spoke to all Israel in the Jordan, and it goes through where they were. This isn't even all of the exhaustive verse here, but it's the beginning where it names Moses and all Israel. A little bit later, I should have included God's name as well. And then it goes through the historical context. So what has led them up to that point? Remember, what's the context of Deuteronomy? Does anybody remember? The book of Deuteronomy is about historically what has just happened and what's about to happen. Does anybody remember?
Going through the Egypt, or going through the
Yep.
wandering.
Wandering.
40
Yep.
years,
Yep.
And about to go into,
No, exactly.
yeah.
So
Promised land.
they were brought out of Egypt, and then they went to Sinai. They engaged in the covenant ratification ceremony. They're told to go enter the land, and they send the spies out, right? And the spies say, guys, this doesn't look good. Like they're gonna beat us. And God says, I'm telling you to go. Trust me. And they're like, no. And God says, well, then you're gonna go to your room. And so there's this wandering, right? They wander for 40 years. And if you look at the censuses, there's 2 censuses in the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 1, it talks about all the people. Numbers 26, it talks about all the people. And at the end of chapter 26, the very harrowing, and none were left from the previous generation except Joshua, son of Nun, and was it Caleb? Those 2. And then you go into Deuteronomy. So they've gone through the wandering. So the historical context of Deuteronomy sets this all out. Sending of the spies, but you didn't listen to me. And then it talks about how Moses is going to be denied entry into the promised land, but Joshua will get it. So is God happy with the history up to this point? Not particularly. So the history doesn't have to be happy, but it's the history. And then you get into the covenant stipulations. So this is, Moses before the people about to go into the land. And it talks about worship. It talks about the order of society, kings, prophets, priests, judges, all the civil law stuff that we're used to. So what happens if, somebody is killed? Is it on purpose or is it accidental? Then you do this, you do that. The purity and the cleanliness laws, we're going to talk a lot about that later. Stealing, treatment of laborers. This was the civil law of Israel. Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy in particular. There's some in Numbers as well, but it's mainly those 3. There wasn't any other code of laws. If you want to know what the order of Israelite society was, it's in the Torah and it's in those books. So it covers all of that. And then you get the blessings and the curses. The famous chapter 28 mirrored in Leviticus chapter 26. So if you will only obey the Lord your God, all these blessings will come upon you. And I love this word, overtake you. You'll be lavished with the blessings. There'll be plentiful harvest. There's going to be peace. I will walk with you and be your God, and you will be my people. This is God's presence. And this is what you see in the book of Joshua. Even like Joshua 24, you get to the end. Joshua is speaking to the people, and he's basically like, how things have been going well? It's because we've been obedient. And now we need to continue to be obedient. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, etc. But if you will not obey the Lord your God and diligently observing all his commandments, which I'm commanding you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. You will be lavished with curses. So poor harvest, war, famine, the devastation of Israel. Your enemies will rule over you. You will no longer have the land. This is the book of Judges. Joshua, they're obedient. There's covenant blessing. And then they make inroads in the land. They get their land. They're established there with the tabernacle. God is dwelling with them. Everybody's happy. They're finding victory. It's all good. And then you see the recursive cycles in Judges where they're disobedient. And a judge comes up, delivers them. There's peace in the land until they're disobedient again. And you can even see in there the escalation of the covenant curses. They get worse and worse and worse as they continue being disobedient. And then the oath. You stand assembled today, all of you, before the Lord your God, to enter into the covenant of the Lord your God sworn by an oath. So the entering into a covenant sworn by an oath. Again, if you don't believe me, it's right in the Bible. And then the witnesses, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that have set before you life and death, blessing and curses. Interesting. Heaven and earth, all the cosmos again, just like in the Hittite treaty, are called as witnesses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, holding fast to him, etc., etc. So you can see this is set up in the same genre as the ancient vassal treaties. And I think maybe you're wondering, okay, Ryan, fine, I get it, but cool. Who cares? What am I supposed to do with that? It's a neat little parlor trick, but so here, let me ask, why do you think it matters, or don't you? And you think I'm actually wasting your time this morning, which I would hope to prove to you is false by the end, but you can admit it now if you want. It won't hurt my feelings.
Well, it's a language they would understand.
That's exactly true.
Yeah, very relevant to.
They knew what they were getting into and how they would have believed their relationship to God and what was required. It's much easier to understand the covenant curses coming upon you, not as like, oh, we're just learning about this angry God. It's well, it's our suzerain. Like, we're part of this treaty. This is how things go. So that's one.
Are there any other treaties written about between a God and a people, or are the other ones just
And people to people.
Just people to people.
so?
That's a difference.
Yep, that is definitely a difference. Yes, Lois.
It seems to me that God is building a society here, a culture,
Mhm.
because when the Israelites came back from Egypt, they had no government, it's what you said. This is their government, this is their laws.
Mhm.
But in the past, they had a pharaoh, a king, somebody in charge. They don't specifically have that now. Moses was, and then Joshua was, and some was, but they were designated a king.
Mhm.
God had to, well, God doesn't have to do anything. But I think it was necessary for him to outline how you live in peace and prosperity without killing each other.
Mhm. There's sort of what is it going to take to have an ordered society that is also faithful to the covenant with Yahweh, like, consistent with who Yahweh is. So here I'm going to ask here some questions and then get around to answering my who cares question. So first of all, has anybody heard this or thought this before? How could God impose hundreds of laws on people and expect them to keep them? Is this something that you've either heard or thought yourself before? How about like, these laws are just so weird. Why would an almighty God care if I eat lobster? Okay, there's the whole, you're not allowed, some foods are unclean, like shellfish you're not allowed to eat. Pork you're not allowed to eat. Or remember, you shall not make for yourselves clothes of more than one fabric, I think, or I forget exactly the word. Or you shouldn't crossbreed animals, or you shouldn't sow more than one seed. Like, God made the whole cosmos, and he's worried about whether you're wearing a polyester cotton blend.
They were supposed to be an example to the rest of the world.
Yes, you know the answer already, Bart. but like that, this comes up, especially if you get into this where we don't follow all the commandments today, and so people can ask us like, are we violating God's law, or do we just pick the ones that represent things we don't like, and we tell people you shouldn't do that because it's in Leviticus. But we don't do everything that's in Leviticus. And so they're like, well, you're just, this is cafeteria Christianity, right? You get to go pick some of what you want, leave some of what you don't. That's an accusation that's often leveled against Christians when we talk about what we think is appropriate for interpersonal relationships or civil society, and we use references in the Old Testament.
What was that in the new covenant though?
You know the answer too, Jenny. Right, exactly. But this is why I think it matters. If we can understand all of I think if you understand the ancient Near Eastern context, you understand the nature of vassal treaties, you get why, or you can get to the answer to these questions. So I think theologically, we can get there if we kind of go through the ancient context behind it, and then we can bridge to today. So that's why I think it matters. So I'm going to start with this one. So is it fair for God to impose all these laws? And so I'm going to go back to this question. One of the rules of the covenant was that they're entered into you enter into a covenant by force or by choice. Yes, if it's imposed, it's not a covenant. And so was the Sinai covenant entered into by choice?
Yes.
Right, so we can look at this. We see this in Exodus 19, Exodus 24. So I read Exodus 19 at the beginning. So this is the offer of the covenant. So therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession out of all people. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. So that's the offer that's given to Moses to go back to the people. And you've got the big if in here. So if you do this, then you have, and I guess if is obeying the commandments, cleanliness, holiness, moral laws, etc. If you do these, you're gonna have blessing, which we've already covered a bit, and if you don't, there's gonna be cursing. And then all the people responded together, Exodus 19:8, we will do all that the Lord has spoken. Moses comes down, tells them this, and they say, okay, we're gonna do it. But even that itself wasn't quite enough. That's sort of the preliminary agreement. That's like, hey, will you enter a new covenant? Sure, fine. But covenants have the ratification ceremony, right? We talked about that with the animals and the passing through, and like that's when it became official. Israel takes this solemn oath of agreement as well. You can find this in Exodus 24, which includes the animal sacrifice. So Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He sent the young men of the people to Israel, or young men of the people of Israel, who offered burnt offerings, sacrificed oxen as offerings of well-being to the Lord. Moses took half the blood, put it in basins, and half he dashed against the altar. And he took the book of the covenant, read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people, and said, see the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So you have the animal sacrifice, you have the reading of the covenant stipulations, you have the response, the oath, we are going to do this, we will be obedient, and then the blood of the covenant goes on that. And then the blood of the covenant goes elsewhere. Where else?
Altar.
On the altar, and the altar, of course, symbolizing here, God, right. So you have, on multiple occasions, you have Moses coming down and saying, all right, so these are the stipulations. And in Exodus 19, they say, okay, we'll do it. And then in Exodus 24, like, it's about to get serious. Okay, we're gonna do the sacrifice. We've got the blood. I'm gonna read it again. The blood goes on the altar. And you guys say, we will do this. We will obey what the Lord has said. All right, and there's the blood sealing the covenant. So the covenant was made between the Israelites and God, very explicitly in Scripture. And so God didn't impose the Sinai laws. They were agreed upon by the Israelites. And notice here too, who is the party to the covenant? So it's God and it's
Israel.
Those people there in Israel. Were the Canaanites part of this covenant? Were the Egyptians part of this covenant? Were the Assyrians part of the covenant? Are they ever described as maybe wicked because they're not following the Sinai covenant per se? No. This was not the universal moral law for all people at all times. This is not the universal moral law for all people at that time. This was a covenant relationship between Israel and Yahweh because they were his treasured possession, his royal priesthood, the holy nation, holy, set apart, different from the others. They were, just like the Levites were the priestly tribe within Israel, and they attended the temple, and they played by somewhat different rules because they were the mediators at the temple between God and the people. So Israel are the priests, the mediators, the ones through whom the Abrahamic blessing is going to come to the world between Yahweh and the rest of humanity. But they, just like the Levites, had a different set of rules, so Israel has a different set of rules. So this covenant right here was intended specifically between those two parties. And that's an important thing to grasp about theologically its implications. So I've got enough time to pause if there's any questions about that. Or I can just keep going because everything I said made perfect sense because I'm just that good.
Well, I wonder when they say Israel's to be a priestly nation, the priest is the intercessor, the forgiver.
Mediator, yeah.
Mediator, yeah. How would that have been visualized of them being the priestly nation for the whole known world? What it sounds like.
Yeah.
I don't know how that exactly would work.
Yeah, I'll take a try at it, which is, so they believed, remember we go back to the theology of who Yahweh is, and that Yahweh was the supreme deity. and that, all others, though they might exist as, spiritual beings, there was no God aside from Yahweh that was at least worthy of worship. And Yahweh said that, my blessing is going to go to the whole world through you to Abraham. And then the descendants at Sinai are the descendants of Abraham. So they are, Abraham's descendants were parties of the covenant. And so they would see themselves as the bearers of the revelation of the supreme God, who they are supposed to bring that into the world, I guess the way that Yahweh describes. And initially, you're to go into the land. We're gonna make a beachhead right here. But I don't think it was fully understood. I think you need to really have a canonical view of this to see Jesus in the redemptive plan before it all makes sense. And so to answer your question specifically, how would they have thought about that prior to Jesus? I think that's a good question. I don't know. Because I don't think they believe that their goal was to ultimately conquer the whole world. And bring everything under the Davidic king. I don't see any evidence of that. So it's a good question.
Can I try maybe the fact
Yeah,
that
please.
how they could be a priest of the nations is that if they do what God asks, they will be blessed with over lavishly, and nobody could overpower them. So if they try, as later on, especially like with King David, and that God was protecting them and nobody could do it, so his kingdom grew and grew. And earlier with Judges, every time God stepped in for them, nobody could withstand. So they could be, hey, if we live like them, we'll be protected. Or so
Yeah.
maybe they were that type of an example of God showing his power through them.
What you said, Mark, made me think of the end of the book of Isaiah. So I don't know what they would have thought at the time of the Exodus or going into the land. But the end of the book of Isaiah talks about how all the nations are going to eventually worship Yahweh. There was a development in the theology that somehow it would be that Yahweh would be recognized as the supreme for the whole world. I don't know mechanistically how they thought that would happen, or if they did, they just believed it would happen eventually. But you look at the latter part of Isaiah, probably from 52 all the way through 66, and this idea that Yahweh will be worshipped among all the nations comes through.
It has a feeling of some compassion for the surrounding nations, desire for them to understand Yahweh, forgiveness, as opposed to derision of the surrounding nations,
Yes, they're to
which we
be
see unfolding.
gathered in.
Is this question in some ways sort of a version 2 of a question about the Abrahamic covenant, where he says, your offspring will be numerous and will be blessed, and they will be a blessing.
It will be a blessing.
How were they to be a blessing?
Yeah.
What did that mean then? And
Yeah.
is this a similar question
Yeah.
in the Sinai covenant?
So it's easy for me to answer knowing the answer because we're on the other side of redemptive
That
history.
usually helps.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you as to what maybe Abraham would have thought that meant.
Yeah.
If Abraham would have even had if you'd asked Abraham, what does that mean? Would Abraham have a very, systematic, logical answer for you? Or would he be like, it's what God promised? I don't know.
Was there any provision made for someone, like say a Hittite said, hey, this sounds pretty good, I'd like to do this? Or do you have to be Hebrew blood?
No, this is a great question. Anybody know a name of somebody who was grafted into the Israelites?
Rahab and Ruth,
Rahab and Ruth, yes.
both
Yeah.
of God,
Yeah.
Jesus' lineage.
Basically, they became Jewish.
Correct.
There
They
were no,
it wasn't, it was not an ethno state because of those examples where you could be grafted into the community.
Well, that's what I was saying, that through the example of what God was doing for them, Rahab said, hey, I'm on your side.
Yeah, I'm with you.
So that's how they would be a priesthood to the world.
And I know there are passages, I can't remember the verses, where, that specifically provide for non-Jews
Yes.
to become part of the covenant. And with respect to men at least, the one requirement was circumcision.
Sign of the Abrahamic covenant.
Which I believe is what the whole deal between Peter and Paul was about, and why Peter really, ought to be cut a lot more slack than he's really given. Because if you read those verses in the Old Testament, his approach to the Gentiles and circumcision seemed to be scriptural, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it was, the book of Galatians is the controversy.
Right.
Where Paul's got a pretty strong view of circumcision that eventually is the way it's to be thought of, because the covenant goes out to Jew and Gentile alike. But yeah.
But in the Old Testament, it expressly contemplated that others could join this covenant.
Yes, you're right. Okay, so I'm going to try and move on to the next question here. So about the strangeness of the laws. So, the infamous book of Leviticus, it's the one that we all like to go read, right? I want to try and demystify this a little bit to try and answer this question, because I think if we see the structure of Leviticus and what it's all about, because when you read it, it can just be like, and then it's a law, and then it's a law, and then it's a law. It's like, oh, goodness gracious, like, when does this end? And these things don't logically associate with each other. I don't even know. I have no breadcrumbs to get home. I'm lost. So I want to go into this to try and make a little bit of sense of these laws by looking at Leviticus. So Leviticus, the word, Levite, this is Levite stuff. So remember I said, the priests have a set of rules because they're the priests and you have to know how you're to work at the tabernacle. And then the priests were also people who administered the civil law quite often. So, I just talked about that. This is the handbook of the priests, essentially. It contains the code of laws of Israel along with Exodus and Deuteronomy. We've covered that as well. In the interest of time, I'll just kind of move on. So here's the outline of Leviticus. If you wondered what Leviticus is talking about, this is what it's talking about. It opens with a discussion of the sacrificial system and how the priests are to administer the sacrificial system. And then you go into the installation of priests. How do you pick people? How do you, make somebody one of the priests? And then you get into the first section of the law, which is clean versus unclean things. You may hear this referred to as the holiness code. You may also hear this referred to as the cleanliness code. That's the word that I'm going to use. In the middle, then you have the instructions for the Day of Atonement. And then you have what I'm calling the moral law. So this is when it starts to get to particular behavioral things, stuff that, we're familiar with throughout here about sacrifices, worship, sexual behavior, festivals, and then you get the blessings and curses of the covenant. And then finally, it finishes with the valuations for vows and tithes. So this is the structure of Leviticus. And this separation here between the clean and the unclean and the moral law is going to be important. All right, so clean versus unclean. So what does this even mean? If you look at the end of the section, Leviticus 15, so this is the end, by fire people. This is the end of the that section back here. So you see Leviticus 15:33 is the end of clean versus unclean things. And here, Leviticus 15:31, so the culmination. You must keep the Israelites from their uncleanness so that they do not die by defiling my tabernacle that is among them. So the defiling of the tabernacle, that's interesting, that terminology. We don't really think in terms of the sacred and the profane as much in our society today, at least not nearly the way the ancients did. So unclean things, according to this, desecrate the tabernacle of God. And so if someone is unclean, they cannot participate in worship. They can't participate in the sacrifices. You can't come to the tabernacle. So the cleanliness of the people is related to what it takes to be in the presence of God. Remember, so this faint picture I have off to the side here, what is this picture of? Tabernacle. And what's the thing, the blur that's hovering over the red thing?
Presence there.
Yeah, that's the Shekinah glory. That's the pillar of cloud. That's the presence of God. So the presence of God is in the tabernacle. So for you to be in the presence of God, you needed to be clean. And if you do that, if you are the worthy priest, if you are clean, and the society is operating that way, blessings are going to come, or else you're going to get the curses. Okay, it's not going to be very fun. So I want to dig into a little bit of ancient Near Eastern context on this defiling of the tabernacle and describe what that means a bit more. Temples. In the ancient world, temples were the places of divine residence. It's not like church today. Church is where we gather to worship. No, that's what we're here for, right? We're here for study, we're here for worship, we're here for fellowship, we're here for teaching, for prayer. The temples were where God, the God of the temple, lived. This was a place, and this is hard for us to grasp. Heaven and earth literally meet in a temple in the ancient world. There's the actual realm of the heavens, the actual realm of the earth, and in the temple, there is an intersection. The sanctuary was both heaven and earth. It was stay with me here. It is the portal where the heavenly can enter the terrestrial realm. This is what people thought of when they were going into these temples. This here, just a quote from Michael Hundley's book, Gods and Dwellings. The temple was the site of a semi-permanent theophany. Theophany is like an appearance of God. Theos, God, pheny, mean appearance, manifestation. So like the Shekinah glory in Exodus chapter 40, Isaiah's vision, Isaiah chapter 6, that's an appearance of God, the theophany. Transfiguration. So like imagine if you could go at any point in time and see what they saw at the transfiguration. Okay, that would be pretty incredible, right? Semi-permanent theophany. It wouldn't be that dramatic, but that's what you think you're entering into when you're going into a temple. As long as the deity remained content. If the God was happy, the God would be present there. And so that's why they control and isolate the environment. You have to keep the God happy. Happy, you know the saying, happy God, happy life, right? And at the center of the temple, I'm going to make that joke in one of the other slides later, but I moved it up right here. At the center of the temple was an image of the god. Here's Shamash, the Mesopotamian sun god. And this is a crafted cultic piece. Cultic just means it was a part of the ritual worship. It was the vessel for the god, the essence of the god. So this image was made, they would pick you got to make the god happy, right? The god has to like your image if the god is going to eventually inhabit the image. So you're going to use the best stuff you can find. You're going to work really hard on it. And there's going to be these rituals to determine whether or not the god is pleased with the image. And if not, well, we got to keep working on it. And if this isn't really happening, we got to start over and come up with a new image until you get one that the god is satisfied with. And then the god had its eyes, ears, and nose opened at the inauguration of the temple so that the spirit of the god could enter the image. And now the semi-permanent theophany is there. The God is dwelling in the temple. It is the house of the God, and that is the sacred intersection of heaven and earth. Just a quick digression here. This here, the ziggurat of Ur in Babylon. You may have heard the word ziggurats before. You see the stairs going up. So this was the staircase going up to where? Thinking the way that they would think. It's going up to the heavens, right? Intersection of the heavens and earth. This is, by the way, not so they could reach the heavens. That wasn't the point. It's so the gods could come down from heaven to be there with them. And in fact, and I wish I had enough time to go into this, Tower of Babel was a ziggurat trying to bring God down, trying to possess God on their own terms. Okay. So let's go, let me try and bring this back to the purity part. So remember, there's no laws of physics, there's no natural laws, everything in the world happens from the gods, right? So the temple is where you're going to greet the god. Remember, there's great symbiosis. Humans were created because the labor for the gods was just too much. Just too much to be a god. It's a hard job. So we're going to make humans, and they're going to come provide my needs, and in exchange, I'm going to provide the blessings for them, right? So you are coming into the temple, into this intersection between heaven and earth, the sacred space, and you are doing this to give the God what the God made you for, what the God needs, food, money, music, whatever. And therefore, you have a happy God who can sustain your community. So you approach the presence of the God in the temple with your offering, quite literally praying that your offer is going to be acceptable to the God. So the ancient Near Eastern conception of this is that we really got to make sure the God is happy. Because if the God's not happy, what happens? Things go poorly for us. And in John Walton's words, I like this, I couldn't resist quoting it. The gods were, quote, persnickety and petty. Purity is designed to meet their exacting demands so that they would not express their inherently temperamental nature. So the gods were really finicky, and like, you don't want an unhappy storm god. Okay, all right, that's either going to mean drought or that's going to mean really bad storms. So you have to, the pure people and the pure offerings were your best chance at pleasing the gods. You had to minimize the likelihood that the God was not going to accept your offering, because if the God didn't accept your offering, bad things are going to happen. And the first thing the priests are going to do with you, if your offering was temporarily accompanied by something bad happening, like a plague of locusts, okay, off with your head. Okay, cool. We've cleansed the badness. That's never going to happen again, God. Sorry. We have dealt with that person. Feedback has been provided. So that's how people thought about temples. Yeah, this is a happy God, happy life thing. Now, the Israelites had a temple too, right? They had a place where God lived, among them the tabernacle. And there's some similarity. So we've already talked about the presence of God. Now, this was not a great symbiosis. You are not going to Yahweh to satisfy Yahweh's needs. Yahweh didn't create humans in a symbiotic relationship. But the purity aspect that you see in the other ancient Near Eastern temples is still important. So the main thrust of the Sinai covenant, so when you get through the blessings, the last blessing before the curses in the book of Leviticus is this tripartite promise. I will walk with you and be your God, and you will be my people. The very presence of God will dwell with you if you are obedient. So when did the presence of God come? That would be Exodus chapter 40. This is the cloud entering the tent of meeting. I've now gone on for too long, so I'm not going to read this whole bit. But this is once that'll probably take too much time anyway, but after the golden calf, they come down. There's that bit at the end of Exodus 35 through 39, which is just a really elaborate description of how to make the tabernacle, right? So you're going to have all these gold strands, and you're going to have these purple things, and there's going to be the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant. Very, very intricate description of what it is to make the tabernacle. And then it ends here. And the cloud covered the tent of meeting, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. You can see how sacred that space was by how much time is spent on that. If you want to know why that's all there, it is to tell you just how exacting they were trying to be in building this dwelling place for God to be among them. And then God accepts it and inhabits the tabernacle. And so the glory of the Lord is there, and the pillar of cloud by fire by night, cloud by day. So Yahweh then, through the Sinai covenant, confers a holy status on his people. This is the royal priesthood, the treasured possession, holy nation. And these qualities have to be evidenced in their lives as his priests, the purity part, because, and I would say two things here, he cares about damage done to ourselves, his images. So these are ones that are pretty easy for us to understand. Murder or lying, theft, and everything is harmful to us. And he also cares about purity because he cares about how we identify ourselves as his people, as the royal priesthood for the dwelling of God among us. So this, I think, is easier to understand as ancient Near Eastern context. For instance, let's actually, before I go into that, let me kind of bring myself back here. So you have God, you've God in the temple. You have the people who are the special people, the priests. And how are those people supposed to reflect the blessing into the world? Well, we have all of these laws. So why these laws and not other laws? Well, this goes, Mark, to where you were getting at the beginning. I think there is something very differentiating between the Israelite religion and all of the other religions at the time that you see come out in the law. And so I'm going to give a few examples. For instance, there were gods of fertility, pretty much, all abounding. So I'll leave it to the imagination to think about what the worship of the god of fertility was like. All I'll say is a lot of people didn't skip church. And yeah, took a little bit. But that was a particular form of worship that was antithetical to what Yahweh was, what the right worship of Yahweh was. Actually, you see, in contrast to the ancient Near Eastern fertility rites, intercourse made people unclean. You couldn't approach the temple. Now, it's not that that's bad. There's not going to be humans if you don't have that. But there is a distinction, a separation between that activity and the worship of Yahweh that was mixed in other cultures. How about touching a dead body? Okay, someone's got to bury the dead. Okay, it was not ancient practice to just let the corpse stay there. Nope, we can't touch it. You do it. No, you do it. No, you do it. No, you do it. Like you have to bury the dead. But there was worship of the dead in ancient Near Eastern cultures. There were the gods of the underworld. There's a separation between the activity of caring for the dead and the worship of Yahweh. Yahweh is not worshipped like that. You're not going to allow those things to seem like they go together. Likewise, the ancients worshipped many gods. We talked about this before. And so this whole thing about you shall not crossbreed two different kinds of livestock. Your fields will not have two different kinds of seed in them. Your garments will not have two kinds of cloths there. It's the purity of monotheistic worship, that we worship one, not many. It was the outward symbol of that this people is a holy people. This people is set aside as something different, and as people who followed Yahweh, the one supreme God, as opposed to this, potpourri of gods that you find elsewhere. So being clean or unclean reflected one's status at the tabernacle. This is not equivalent to sin. Okay, there's like childbirth made one unclean. Okay, having a child is not sinful, just in case anybody was wondering. It's incredibly important, but it does make one unclean. It's a separation. It's whether or not you are in a holy enough status to participate in sacrifice or worship. It's a temporary state. Uncleanness goes away. Sometimes uncleanness just lasts a couple hours, and then you're fine. I am going to say we are not sure why all the laws were given. I'm not going to be able to tell you, name a law, and I'll tell you exactly, which part this refers to. But it does seem to contrast with some of these Canaanite practices. It seems to be a separation of the, carnal bodily things that make us, that we have in common with all humans, from the vocation as being the priests of Yahweh. So it seems to be part of creating that separation. I'll skip that part just for the sake of time. But so then when you have blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience, no distinction is made between the cleanliness laws and the moral laws. You had to keep all of them. So the blessing, the continuous presence of God was dependent upon obedience to both of these. And so it was vital for the holy status of Israel to maintain their covenant status as the royal priests, that they kept all of the law. And that includes those cleanliness laws. So my second point here, these laws, the cleanliness laws, were specifically designed to keep God around, right? God is dwelling in the temple. When God is happy, I will walk with you and be your God, and you will be my people. They wanted life, not death, blessing, not cursing. And these were about how they acted as the royal priests, set apart, holy, different from the others at that time, worshiping in truth, as opposed to worshiping the ways that the rest of the cultures around them did. This is on Yahweh's terms. Okay, I'm going to see if I can get through this. Okay, do these laws matter today? I can't leave you without going through this part. So, especially because I've kind of doubled down and said, hey, these things were important. Okay, do the laws matter today? Go and point first. Some, but not others. We have to look at some of these distinctions between the cleanliness and the moral law and how they played out. So we looked at that outline at the beginning. There's a clear break, even in Leviticus, between the cleanliness laws and the moral laws, just even in the book, separated by Yom Kippur. So we have a list of things that we're used to seeing as part of the moral laws. things that, about forbidden sacrifices, sexual relationships, having to, how to live a holy and just life. This would be, interestingly, 2 greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, strength. And second one is,
Love your neighbor as yourself.
did Jesus come up with that on the fly? No, where's it from?
The Old Testament, you probably.
Leviticus chapter 19. Right there. Interesting. He quotes from the Sinai Law. When you look at the most severe crimes in the Torah, so the most severe things in the moral law, you see false worship, so worshiping other gods, sacrificing to other gods, blasphemy, Sabbath breaking. Sabbath breaking is very, very significant. Cursing one's parents, murder, certain sexual practices, kidnapping, and false testimony in court. If you go down this list, does it seem similar to another list you may have seen in the Old Testament someplace? Hey, how about that? It sure seems to follow the outline pretty darn well. So the commandments actually seem to summarize the most significant parts of their law. Yes.
One quick question, you may have said this and I missed it. You said those are the most severe crimes. If I went to the text, would they have more severe penalties than others?
They could have death penalties attached to them. Yeah. You could call those not universally, you can't just say someone died, but yeah, they're capital crimes in the Torah. Sabbath breaking could be a capital crime. Okay. So do these laws matter today? These things for us, are they binding on us today? Well, remember, there's an agreement between 2 specified parties, right? And who are the specified parties here? I showed the answer before I asked the question. So is that us? No. Does the New Testament say we must obey the law? The law of Moses. And I said, I know. We're getting there, it's okay. But Galatians in particular says that we're no longer bound by the law, right? Okay, so we can ignore it, right? Right?
No.
Of course not, no. So, but why? All right, and this is, Jenny, this is sort of where you were going. So Jesus quotes from the law often. We already talked about that, love your neighbor as yourself. The Sermon on the Mount is tightly bound up in the law. And actually, Jesus is escalating a lot of those things in the Sinai law. So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth becomes don't resist an evildoer. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I say to you, love them both. Do not murder. I say to you, do not be angry. Do not commit adultery. I say, do not lust. So there's actually there's doubling down on a lot of the moral commands that you find in the Torah. And the character of God is unchanging. So some of these things that reflect the character of God, we would expect to be enduring. We'll skip those for now. But what about the cleanliness laws? What was the point of the cleanliness laws that I said before? It was
Enter the temple.
to enter the tabernacle, right? To determine who could approach the temple or the tabernacle. Does it still exist today? Correct. Actually, let's go. Remember when I said, when the curses of the covenant are executed, the covenant is over. Remember that big slide? So which biblical covenant had curses associated with it? What we're talking about today, right? Were the covenant curses executed?
Yes.
You know I'm going there. When? What moment in history was the culmination, in Israelite history, the culmination of the covenant curses?
80, 70?
That's a good answer. I'm going to go for a different one for a particular reason, but some people would make that argument.
Exiles. I don't know.
Yeah, right. So that's where I'm going to go.
Okay.
Now, there's a fair argument that could be made that 80, 70, the destruction of the Second Temple would be the full culmination. I'm going to make an argument as to why I think it is the Babylonian exile. But we'll start here, right? They don't have a land anymore. They don't have their king anymore. Their enemies are ruling over them. the presence of Yahweh, and this is the big one, the presence of Yahweh is no longer there. Remember Ezekiel chapter 10, he saw the glory of the Lord depart the temple. And then the sacking of Jerusalem happens. And then, they head into exile. All of the covenant curses, you can go through them, and that's pretty much what's happening in the exile. They've lost the presence of their God, they've lost their king, they've lost their land, they've lost their temple, they've lost it all. And now they are under somebody else. So what does that mean about the covenant? Let's assume I'm right. The covenant is over. And when they rebuilt the temple, and this is why I'm going with the Babylonian exile, what are they perturbed about when the second temple is built?
God doesn't come back to the.
Shekinah glory never came back. What is the primary blessing? I will walk with you and be your God, and you will be my people, and God will dwell among them. But God with us didn't come back until Jesus. And then Pentecost is another situation like that. Shekinah glory never returns. And so what does it mean about whether the terms of the covenant are binding on us today? Well, if the covenant curses are executed, then the covenant's over. The binding nature is only insofar as they're reiterated in the new covenant. And so you see that distinction that's made in the new covenant. Jesus upholds the moral law, like we talked about with the Sermon on the Mount, but the cleanliness laws, actually the food laws, are rejected in the New Testament. And thus he made all foods clean, is like literally a line from the book of Acts. Circumcision is no longer a requirement, it's the book of Galatians. So we are not parties to the Sinai covenant. We're not bound to the Sinai law proper. There's no temple we could even be unclean to approach. The temple is now, are not your bodies temples of the Holy Spirit. But the Sinai principles that are reiterated under the new covenant can persist today. And so that's why if somebody's like, well, you pick and choose from the Bible, you follow some things and not others from Leviticus or Exodus, you could take them through a tour of ancient Near Eastern vassal treaties and how they worked and how when the curses are executed, the covenant's not binding anymore, but we're under a new covenant, which is inspired in some sense by that old covenant, but not all of the stipulations continue. So that, I believe, is my last slide for now. Yes. Are there any questions? Was that last part at least helpful? Getting through to how that all worked, like why it was really helpful to me to understand. I never really got, okay, but the laws are in the Bible. And you're telling me I don't have to follow part of the Bible, but I'm supposed to follow the Bible. So this doesn't make sense. And so seeing how these things function, it's a vassal treaty. There's blessings and curses. The curses are executed. Here's how you can know. Therefore, the treaty is not binding anymore. It wasn't even with you anyway. It was with them. Covenants were with very specific people. We are party to a different covenant that included some of those stipulations, but not others. It's like, oh, all right, I get it. Cool, makes sense. So that's, there are, yes, Steve.
Okay, if I'm remembering correctly, a couple of weeks ago, Pastor Paul was preaching and said that we've only got the two commands now. Love God as you said, and love neighbor as yourself. And then he illustrated how, and he said all the other laws hang underneath those two. So if you comment on that, and also the often spoken comment that Jesus nailed the law to the cross. Easy question.
Well, I gotta go get up to the bell choir lot. So to the first one, that all the law and the prophets hang from those two, far be it from me to disagree with Jesus. So I think the way in which we should understand that is what was the point of the cleanliness laws and the holiness laws? The point of them was about how to be a holy people. So, okay, we don't have the exact, rituals anymore of the sacrificial system. That's not how we would enact it today. But if it was about how to be Yahweh's holy people to reflect him into the world, what does that look like today? And so I would say, if the law, how would we say the law continues to hang off of those things, loving God and loving neighbor, we can try and you won't have to sacrifice any turtle doves, but there's still something of what does it mean to be Yahweh's holy people? So that's how I would answer the first one. The second one, that Jesus nailed the law to the cross. So I'd have some conversations with Lutherans about this one. Because the law and gospel distinction doesn't carry as much weight for me, because this wasn't their way of getting to heaven. Was that, did I talk about that at all today in the description of the law? This wasn't their concept of salvation. They didn't have the same sort of theology that we have about inheriting eternal life. And so I think that that phrase that Jesus nailed the law to the cross presumes that following the law was what you could do to be right with God in the same way that grace makes us right with God today. I don't quite see those two things as equivalent. I think there is an injured relationship that comes with being human and our inherent sinfulness. As we're going to talk about next week, even the categories of sin in the Old Testament don't map neatly to the categories of sin in the New Testament. So I don't know, and maybe if I would hear myself give my answer again later, I might disagree with myself a little bit, but I think, I don't know, I think it's mixing of categories to say that. I don't know, what do you think? Disagree with me?
This is really hard. It's really,
Yeah.
really difficult.
Yeah. Kevin, and then I'm gonna have to, unfortunately.
There's lots of images in scripture, and they are images, but images are also important. I think the New Testament talks about how the covenant of the law was ended and a new covenant was established.
Mhm.
I know that sin was nailed to the cross, and Jesus became sin for us, but I don't know where it actually says the law was nailed to the cross. And I think we might be mixing metaphors or mixing images when we say that.
I'm inclined to kind of agree with that, and you see, though there is a mixing there too, but, I really want to go into it, but I can't. Book of Daniel chapter 9 is where I would refer you. Where sin and obedience to the law, but also introducing the new category of what needs to be fixed comes in. So, all right.
Can I make one last observation?
Yes, but I'm going to sign off with everybody remotely. So thank you for listening.
Patients are not short.